Hello everyone. I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story.
Story 1. The Watcher in the Pines Eye had always been drawn to the solitude of the forest. As a park ranger in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, I found peace in the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. But that peace was shattered one late autumn evening. It began like any other shift. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows between the towering pines. My partner, Dave, and I were conducting our usual patrol, ensuring that all campers had returned to their sites and that the trails were clear. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled our lungs. We reached a secluded area known for its dense underbrush and narrow trails. It was a spot few ventured into, and even fewer returned from without a story to tell. As we walked, I noticed something unusual, a series of small, deliberate marks carved into the bark of several trees. They were too precise to be the work of animals, yet too crude for a human hand. I pointed them out to Dave, but he shrugged it off as the work of bored campers. That night, as we sat in the ranger station, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. A call came in from a hiker who had become lost on the trails. We gathered our gear and set out immediately, the darkness swallowing us as we ventured deeper into the forest. The search lasted hours, but we found no sign of the missing hiker. Exhausted and frustrated, we returned to the station, only to find that the marks on the trees had multiplied. They were no longer just in the secluded area, but had spread throughout the park. Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated. Campers reported hearing whispers in the night, footsteps following them on the trails, and glimpses of shadowy figures just beyond the reach of their campfires. One morning, we found a campsite abandoned in haste, a half-eaten meal still on the table, and a single word carved into the dirt: leave. Then came the most chilling discovery. A local hermit, known for his eccentric behavior and reclusive nature, was found dead in his cabin. His eyes were wide open, his mouth agape in a silent scream. The only clue was a journal entry scrawled in his handwriting: "The Watcher is real." We delved into the park's history and uncovered a disturbing pattern. Decades ago, a series of disappearances had occurred in the same area where the marks were found. Each case had been dismissed as accidents or the work of wild animals, but the similarities were too striking to ignore. Determined to uncover the truth, I ventured into the heart of the forest alone. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. I stumbled upon a clearing where the ground was disturbed, as if something had been buried hastily. Digging with my bare hands, I unearthed a weathered box. Inside were photographs of past rangers, their faces marked with the same strange symbols found on the trees. Among the photos was a note: "The Watcher sees all." Suddenly, a presence loomed behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, growing louder, more insistent. I fled, the box clutched tightly in my hands. Back at the station, I showed Dave the box and its contents. His face drained of color as he recognized one of the faces in the photographs. It was his own father, a former ranger who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. We realized then that the Watcher was not just a myth, but a malevolent force that had been lurking in the forest for generations, feeding on fear and drawing power from the souls of those who ventured too deep. Determined to end the terror, we sought the help of a local historian who specialized in the occult. She revealed that the area had once been the site of ancient rituals, where settlers had attempted to commune with dark entities. The Watcher, she explained, was the manifestation of those entities, bound to the forest by the rituals of the past. With this knowledge, we devised a plan to confront the Watcher. Armed with symbols of protection and guided by the historian, we returned to the clearing where I had found the box. As we performed the ritual, the ground trembled, and a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He spoke in a voice that echoed in our minds: "You cannot banish me. I am the forest, and the forest is me." But we persisted, reciting the incantations with unwavering resolve. The figure screamed, a sound that shattered the night, and then, with a final, deafening roar, he vanished. The forest fell silent. In the days that followed, the marks on the trees disappeared and the whispers ceased. Campers returned, and the park slowly returned to normal. But the memory of the Watcher lingered, a reminder of the darkness that can reside in the most serene places. I continued my work as a ranger, but I never ventured into that part of the forest again. Some stories are better left untold, and some places are best left undisturbed. Story 2. They told me it was just an animal, that the woods do things to your mind when you're tired. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard, and I know what followed me out of the trees and still watches from the dark when I close my eyes at night. Because I've been a ranger in the backcountry of Montana for 16 years, and I've seen bears tear into tents, I've seen moose flatten whole campsites, I've seen lightning split trees in half and fires sweep through valleys in hours, but nothing I've seen ever came close to what happened at the North Loop Trailhead near Dry Knife Ridge in the fall of 2019 when I went looking for a missing family of 4 who had set out on a 3-day hike and never came back, their cars still parked at the trailhead. Windows up, granola bar wrappers in the footwell, and no sign of foul play, just empty silence and wind in the lodgepole pines, so I set out alone, as I'd done a dozen times before, loaded up with my pack, satellite radio, bear spray, GPS, and map, and headed north, the trail winding deeper into the backcountry, colder with every mile as the sky dimmed under heavy gray clouds, and for the first 6 hours there was nothing unusual, just the normal quiet of deep forest. The steady rhythm of boots on packed dirt, the smell of pine needles and wet rock. But as I got further in, I started noticing the lack of wildlife, not a single chipmunk, bird, or deer, just this pressing, unnatural stillness, and the wind carried this low, droning sound, like a voice, but too deep, too long, like something groaning just beneath the edge of hearing, and every time I stopped to listen, it would stop too, and then pick up again the moment I moved, and I told myself it was just wind in the rock formations, that I'd been out too long without rest, but that didn't explain the way the trees looked twisted in one direction, all leaning slightly toward the east, as if something had passed overhead and bent them all the same way. And then there were the scratches on the trunks, not claw marks, not like bear's sign, but long, thin gouges, evenly spaced and high, too high for any animal I know. And after 15 miles, I came across the first sign of the missing family, a child's shoe, red, size tiny, sitting in the middle of the trail like it had been placed there, perfectly upright, clean, with no drag marks or scuffs, and I radioed it in, logged the coordinates, and kept going, my pulse ticking faster even though the temperature was dropping. And then I found the campsite, tent collapsed, gear scattered, campfire cold, 2 sleeping bags zipped but empty, and a small stuffed animal, soaked through and sitting against a tree like it had been set there for someone to find. And that's when I saw the footprints, small and barefoot, heading away from the camp and up toward the ridge, and against all logic I followed them. Because that's what we do, we follow, we don't question, we find the lost, but those prints didn't lead anywhere natural. They went up into terrain that didn't make sense, across loose rock and steep inclines where no kid could walk, and after another mile, they just stopped, mid-stride, in the middle of a bare patch of stone with no dirt, no grass, just empty air around them. And I stood there trying to make sense of it when I heard a sound behind me, a voice like a whisper but not in a language I understood, and when I turned there was no one there, just the trees and that groaning wind again. Louder now, like it was circling me, and then I saw it, movement in the trees, tall and thin, not like a bear, not like a man, something wrong in the shape, too long, too smooth, like a shadow that didn't belong, slipping between the trees without sound. And every time I looked directly at it, it was gone, but I could see it in the corners of my eyes, always just beyond. And then the smell hit me, what iron, rot, something dead and long buried, rising with the cold like it was seeping out of the earth itself. And I tried the radio again, static, then a burst of garbled speech, my name, but distorted, stretched like it had come from underwater, and I backed away, retracing my steps, but the trail was gone. covered in fallen branches that hadn't been there before. And I knew then that I wasn't alone, that something was with me, watching, following, maybe even calling me further in, because I began to feel pulled. Like gravity had shifted, and I was being drawn deeper into that ridge, and I turned and ran, tripping on roots, tearing through brambles, and the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices, some pleading, some angry, some laughing in low, guttural bursts, and the trees seemed to lean closer. Branches brushing my shoulders even when there was space before, and then I saw lights ahead, small, flickering, like lanterns in the distance, and I thought maybe I'd found other rangers or a rescue team, but when I got closer, I realized they weren't lanterns. They were eyes glowing, faint yellow, too high and too far apart for any animal, and I froze, heart hammering, and they blinked in unison, slow and deliberate, and I felt this pressure in my chest like my lungs didn't want to breathe, and then I blacked out. Just dropped to the ground with that stench in my nose and the whispering inside my skull. And when I came to, it was morning, and I was lying just off the main trail, a mile from the trailhead, dehydrated, scratched, missing my pack, radio shattered, and I stumbled. Back to the station where they found me and tried to write it off as exposure, fatigue, dehydration. But I knew better, because in my jacket pocket was a drawing, crude, done in charcoal on birch bark, of a tall figure with long arms and a mouth stretched across its torso, filled with rows of teeth, and next to it, for stick figures, crossed out with black lines, and no one could explain how it got there. And when I went back to the site with the team 2 days later, there was no trace of the campsite, no shoe, no stuffed animal, no prints, just forest, silent and still. And when I told my supervisor, he said sometimes the woods take things, and sometimes they give them back, but not always the same, and I took a desk job after that. Stayed near the station, close to town, because something lives in that ridge, something old and hungry, and every fall when the wind shifts just right and I hear it whispering through the trees, I remember those eyes, blinking in the dark, and I wonder how many others went looking and never came back. Story 3. I don't talk about this much, mostly because no one believes me, and also because talking about it seems to call it back, like it's listening, like it never left, just waits in the tree line until someone remembers it again. But you asked for true horror, not a campfire ghost story, and what happened to me back in 2007 as a backcountry park ranger in the Bitterroot wilderness of Montana was real as my missing time, my frostbitten feet, and the scar I still have under my left collarbone. A burn mark in the shape of a hand I didn't recognize and that no doctor could explain. And if you're still reading, then you're either skeptical or brave, but neither will help you where I went, where I was taken, because this place, this stretch of old-growth forest and forgotten trail, it isn't just remote, it's older than memory. It doesn't care what maps say. It doesn't care about GPS or survival gear or experience. It's wild in a way no human has ever tamed, and it watches and waits, and sometimes, if you get too close to its heart, it shows itself, not because it wants you to see it, but because it wants to see what you'll do once you know something else is out there, something that pretends to be wind or owls or voices on the radio, but has teeth and plans and hunger. And it started with a missing hiker, like most ranger stories do. A solo backpacker named Ellie from Missoula who was supposed to be out for 3 days and never came back. Her car still at the trailhead. Her permit in the logbook. Her trail marker headed north toward Deep Elk Basin. And I was on call, seasoned, 10 years in the service. So I packed up and headed out that afternoon, expecting a twisted ankle or maybe a blown tent. Just another rescue op. But as soon as I crossed mile 7, the woods changed. Not in any obvious way, but the quiet got heavier, like the air was waiting, like it had lungs. And the usual signs of animal life were gone. No scat, no tracks, no birdsong, just the faint crunch of my boots and this low hum I thought was tinnitus, but later realized had a rhythm to it, like breathing, long and slow and wrong. And around mile 10, I found her camp, collapsed tent, one boot outside it, gear half-packed like she'd left in a rush, and scratch marks on the trees. Not claw marks, but deep, almost surgical, in parallel rows about 6 feet up, and I radioed in but got only static. Checked my GPS and watched the coordinates flicker and vanish like I was being erased from the map, and something was watching. I knew that suddenly. Not paranoia, but certainty. The same feeling prey gets when the predator hasn't moved yet, but is about to. And I started seeing things, shapes in the corner of my vision. Trees that seemed to be closer each time I blinked. And I told myself it was nerves, dehydration. But then I found the totems, hung from the branches with sinew or hair, small figures made of sticks and teeth. No twine, just natural material, but too clean, too precise. Like someone, or something, had been making them for a long time, and the wind changed direction without warning, coming from ahead of me, carrying with it a smell like rot and iron and stone, and I followed it. God help me, I followed it, until I came to the ridge above the basin and saw something impossible, something I still see when I try to sleep. The forest bent, not metaphorically, but actually curved, like the horizon dipped down in a bowl, and at the center, a clearing perfectly circular, with no snow even though the rest of the forest was under 6 inches, and in the middle, Ellie stood barefoot, head tilted back, mouth open like she was singing or screaming, and surrounding her were these things, tall, too tall, with limbs too long, silhouettes that bent like smoke but cast shadows like bone. And when I stepped forward, the air changed. It got thicker, like syrup, like time was slower there. And the closest thing turned and looked at me. No eyes, but it saw me. I know it saw me, because it moved toward me without moving. And the sound started again, that hum. Only now it was words, hundreds layered over each other, telling me to forget my name, to take off my boots, to lie down and stop pretending I was anything but food. And I ran, or tried to, my legs slow like I was underwater, and the forest didn't fight me. It guided me back, like it wanted me to leave and tell others, like I was a message, not a man. And when I made it back to the trailhead, Ellie's car was gone, her name scrubbed from the permit log, and the ranger station had no record of my dispatch, no call, no file, like I'd imagined the whole thing, except I hadn't, because 3 days had passed, my beard grown, my radio batteries dead, and in my jacket pocket was her bootlace tied around a tooth that wasn't human, and I never went back. I filed a leave of absence and transferred out of state. But sometimes I still hear that hum on windy nights, and once I saw the shape again in a park hundreds of miles away, just watching from the trees, and I knew it remembered me, and maybe one day it'll call me back. But until then, I stay away from deep woods, and I never hike alone. Story 4. I never believed in the things people talk about when they say the woods are haunted. I'm a park ranger, and I've spent more nights under the canopy of trees than most people ever will in a lifetime. I've heard stories, sure, rumors whispered around campfires, locals mentioning odd happenings in the deep, dark corners of the park, but I always brush them off. Nature is wild. It's unpredictable. Things happen that don't always make sense, but that's just the way it is. But this, what happened to me, what I saw, it changed everything. It was late fall when it began. The air was already crisp, the trees shedding their leaves like coins from a purse, and the park was beginning to quiet down. Most of the visitors had already gone back to their homes, leaving only the few diehards who came to enjoy the solitude of the late season. I liked it that way. The park, vast and untamed, felt more like mine then. The patrols, the rounds, the quiet evenings by the ranger station, it all seemed peaceful. Until it wasn't. One evening, the sun had just dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I was finishing up my rounds, checking the trail markers when I saw something strange. It was a figure, standing motionless at the edge of the woods, barely illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. I assumed it was just one of the remaining visitors, someone out there trying to get a last-minute glimpse of the sunset. But something about the way they stood, so still, so unnervingly still, made me pause that I called out to them. "Hey, you okay?" No response. It wasn't unusual for people to ignore calls if they were busy with their own thoughts or too far away, but this was different. Something in my gut told me it wasn't normal. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the leaf-covered ground. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, at the edge of the trees, staring straight ahead. That be why the time I was about 20 feet away, the figure turned its head slowly to face me. The moon was rising now, casting enough light for me to see their features clearly. It was a man, but there was something wrong about him. His face was too pale, his eyes too wide. His mouth was thin, stretched tight, and his clothes were old, frayed at the edges like they hadn't been washed in years. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sir, you okay?" He didn't speak. Instead, he just blinked. Long, deliberate blinks. And then, finally, he spoke in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in ages, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "The woods, they don't forget." The words were like a cold wind. I was used to cryptic remarks from the odd folks who wandered through the park, but this felt like a warning. Something deep in my chest twisted, an old instinct flaring to life. I wanted to tell him to leave, to get back to my patrol, but something kept me rooted in place, my feet unwilling to move. "The woods, they don't forget," he repeated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "And they never forgive." Before I could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. A deep, gnawing sensation in my gut that I didn't see him again that night or the next. But the next evening, I got a call from the dispatcher. A hiker had gone missing. It was nothing too unusual at first. People get lost in the woods all the time, especially when they don't heed the warnings about staying on the marked trails. But when I heard the name, something clicked in my mind. The missing hiker was the same guy I'd seen the night before. It was hard to ignore the connection. I joined the search party, combing through the forest with a sense of urgency gnawing at me. I'd seen too many missing persons reports, too many search and rescue operations to take this lightly. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more I felt something was watching us. The trees creaked in the wind, casting strange shadows on the forest floor. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive. After hours of searching, we found him. But he wasn't the man I had seen the night before. The hiker was pale, his eyes wide open, frozen in place like a statue. His clothes were torn, his skin nearly translucent, as if the life had been drained out of him. His face, it wasn't right. His mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, wide and unnatural. It was a smile I'd seen before. The same smile that the man in the woods had warned that I didn't speak to anyone about it at first. How could I? Who would believe me? It wasn't until the next day that I understood. It wasn't just one person. It wasn't just the hiker. The woods, they were changing. They were alive in ways I hadn't understood before. As the days passed, I began to notice more oddities. I'd walk the same trail over and over, and each time, the markers would be in different places. The trees would look different, as though they'd shifted overnight. I would hear whispers in the wind, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I would walk into a clearing and find it utterly empty, only to turn around and find something watching me from the shadows. But the worst part was when I would return to the ranger station at night. The feeling of being watched would intensify, and sometimes I'd hear footsteps behind me, soft, like someone walking in my footsteps. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I started checking the woods more carefully. I'd go back to the same areas where I'd seen the strange man and found myself drawn deeper into the forest. It wasn't long before I found what I was looking for, or perhaps what was waiting for me. The hollowed-out tree at the center of the old grove was something I'd passed by 100 times before without a second thought. But now, something about it felt wrong. The markings on the tree, ancient symbols carved into the bark, were fresh, newly etched into the wood. They weren't natural. They weren't from anything I'd ever seen in the park. And they were alive. The symbols pulsed with an eerie, dark energy that made my skin crawl that I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew I had to leave. As I turned to walk away, the sound of the man's voice echoed through the trees. The woods, they never forget. I ran back to the ranger station, but it didn't stop. It didn't stop at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could hear the whispers through the cracks in the walls. And when I dared to open the door, I saw him, standing just outside the station, staring at me with those wide, empty eyes. His mouth stretched into that terrible smile once more. The next morning, I was told another hiker was missing. A woman this time. And then another. And another. People kept disappearing. The park had become a hunting ground, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more I realized something terrible. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was a thing that hungered, a thing that didn't want to be left alone, that I'm not sure how much longer I'll last. The whispers are getting louder, the shadows are getting darker, and every day, it's harder to tell if what I'm seeing is real or just my mind cracking under the weight of this place. I thought I was the one keeping watch over the woods, but now I know the truth. The woods have been keeping watch over me. I don't know if I'll make it out. But if you ever find yourself here, in the woods, at night, don't look too closely at the trees. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't let them see you. Because if you do, you'll never leave. And if you see the man in the woods, don't speak to him. Don't even look at him. Because once he's seen you, you belong to the woods. They won't forget. Story 5. I never believed the stories the old rangers used to tell, the ones they'd mutter over cheap coffee and half-smoked cigarettes as the sun crawled up the pines like it was afraid of what it might find in the darkness. The ones about things that moved in the tree line without wind, shapes too tall, too still, too wrong, and about sounds that didn't belong in any natural order of birds or beasts, sounds like a grown man trying to remember how to cry or a woman trying to forget how. Stories they swore were true but laughed off all the same, stories they carried behind their eyes like old scars. But I'd always chalked them up to loneliness and long shifts in the creak of imagination under pressure until the night I drew rotation at Firewatch 6 up near the ridge, where the radio always hissed like it was whispering secrets you couldn't quite hear in the wind. Never seemed to blow the same direction twice. A night so clear and dry you could hear the pine needles settling in every snap of. A twig felt like a footstep just out of view, and I remember the way the air tasted wrong that evening, like iron and mildew, like something old trying to rot its way into something new. And I just finished the rounds, logged the weather, the temps, the cloud cover. None, and was pouring myself some stale coffee when I caught movement on the western slope, just past marker 113, a flicker like something darting between trees but too fast, too smooth, not the herky-jerky motion of a deer or even a cougar, and I grabbed the binoculars out of habit and scanned the line and saw nothing, just trees blacker than the sky and shadows that seemed to quiver like they were alive. So I radioed it and, like protocol said, got static and returned. Not even the usual pop of the repeater, just a long flat buzz that vibrated in my teeth and made me wince, and I remember saying out loud, "Nope," to no one in particular, because even then, some part of me knew something wasn't right. So I sat back down and tried to ignore the way the wind had just stopped, dead still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. And after about 10 minutes, the radio hissed back on with a voice I didn't recognize, saying my name 3 times, slow and hollow, like it was trying out the syllables for the first time. And then it said, "Come down," followed by this wet choking noise that sounded like a throat filling with mud. And the voice never said a call sign or ID, which every ranger always does, always, because it's drilled into us from day one. And I froze because I'd heard that voice before, not from a person, but from a recording we keep in a locked drawer in the station, the one marked Incident 1978, the one we're told never to play except for training. And even then only with a supervisor present, a scratchy old tape of a ranger who went missing 47 years ago during a storm, who screamed for 3 minutes straight before going quiet, and the only thing he said other than screaming was, "It's not a cave," over and over. And here was that same voice saying my name, telling me to come down. And I sure as hell wasn't going anywhere, but then I heard it again. Not through the radio, but outside the damn tower, down below. Like it was at the base of the fire watch, saying my name in that hollow, wet throat voice. And I grabbed the spotlight and swept it across the base. Saw nothing. Just the steps leading down and the gravel path and the edge of the woods beyond. But when I turned the beam to the trees, they seemed off, like the trunks were breathing, subtly pulsing in and out like lungs, and something was leaning just barely out from behind one of them. Not a body, not exactly, but the idea of one, too thin, too long, the joints all wrong. Like if you drew a person from memory after a nightmare, and it didn't move when the light hit it, didn't blink or flinch or hide, it just stayed there, watching, and I backed away from the railing slow, real slow, and locked the hatch. Like that would mean anything. And then the scratching started on the floorboards, like long nails dragging in a slow spiral from underneath. And I kept telling myself it was raccoons or a bear or hell. Even just my brain eating itself alive with too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But the boards bulged inward like something was pushing against them, pressing up through the planks like the wood itself was about to split. And then the lights flickered. Not just the ones in the tower, but the flashlight and the desk lamp and even my watch display, all of it pulsing to the same slow rhythm like a heartbeat. And I swear I heard whispering inside the static. Hundreds of voices whispering the same thing over and over in a language I didn't recognize but understood in my bones. Something like, "You see us now." And the tower began to sway, not from wind, because the trees were dead still, but like the earth itself was shifting, like the whole ridge was trying to shake me loose. And the radio screamed once, loud and sharp and filled with that same voice now, shrieking like metal being torn apart. And then silence, deep and absolute, like the whole forest had been vacuumed of sound. And then the trapdoor creaked, just once. A single groan like someone had laid their weight on it. And I drew my sidearm and aimed it down the hatch, but there was nothing, no shadow, no movement. Just the echo of that creak hanging in the air like a noose. And I didn't sleep that night, just sat there with my back to the corner and my weapon in my lap and my ears straining for anything at all, but the silence stayed, thick and oily, until dawn finally cracked the sky and the birds started chirping again like nothing had happened. And when I radioed in, the signal came through clear, too clear, like they'd been listening the whole time but just didn't answer. And when the relief shift came up and I tried to explain, they looked at me like I'd gone nuts, said the logs were blank, no weather entries, no check-ins, no voice recordings, and the radio tape was wiped clean, just static. And when I demanded to hear the 1978 recording, the chief told me there never was a tape, never was a missing ranger. Said I must have misunderstood, but I know what I heard, what I felt. And when I went to look at the tree where I'd seen the thing, I found a mark carved deep in the bark, a spiral of jagged lines that bled sap like the tree was weeping, and my name carved beneath it. In letters too tall, too thin, joints all wrong, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, I still hear it calling from the edge of the woods, saying my name in that ruined voice, telling me to come down, come down, come down. Story 6. It was getting late when the first whispers began. Paul had heard the stories before, the local legends of Pine Ridge, but they were always just stories, weren't they? He had heard them as a child, tales spun by the elders about strange occurrences in the woods, disappearances, voices on the wind, shadows lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. But as a seasoned park ranger, Paul dismissed them, chalking them up to superstition, old folklore woven into the fabric of the forest. After all, this was his domain now, and nothing beyond the usual dangers of the wilderness had ever troubled him. Not until tonight. As the sun dipped behind the horizon and the night crept in like a slow, suffocating blanket, Paul started his final rounds, making his way along the patrol route. The wind picked up, rustling through the towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. The trees swayed like dancers, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. There was an eerie stillness to the place tonight. No animals stirred, no insects hummed. The silence was heavy, pressing in on him, and for the first time in years, Paul felt something strange stir in his gut, a creeping unease he couldn't explain. He pushed the feeling aside. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, but even as he said it, the words seemed hollow, empty. His footsteps crunched over the frost-bitten earth, the sound loud in the quiet of the forest. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body, the cold biting at his skin. The campgrounds were empty, closed for the season, and he was the only one in the park tonight, a solitary figure in the vast, dark expanse. His radio crackled to life, the static sharp and unsettling. "Paul? Paul? You copy." The voice sounded distorted, almost as though it was coming from a great distance. It was Sarah, his former partner. But that didn't make sense. Sarah had left the park 2 years ago. There was no reason for her to be calling. "Sarah." Paul responded, his voice a little too sharp, his grip tightening on the radio. "Where are you?" The static hissed louder, then her voice came through again, but it was broken, fragmented, as if someone or something was trying to interfere with the transmission. "Get out, Paul. Don't stay out there. They're coming." The words were rushed, frantic, her breath ragged on the other end. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the transmission cut off, leaving nothing but the soft hum of static. Paul stood frozen for a moment, the radio still crackling in his hand. Something wasn't right. It was too quiet. No animal sounds. No wind. Just nothing. He glanced around, his flashlight sweeping across the dark forest. The beam bounced off the trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him like a second skin. "It's probably just a prank," he muttered under his breath, though the words didn't comfort him. The night felt wrong. Something had changed. He clicked the radio back on, his thumb pressing the button to transmit, but there was only more static. He cursed under his breath, trying to tune it back to the correct frequency. As he fiddled with the radio, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, something darting between the trees, too fast to make out. His heart skipped a beat. He snapped his head in that direction, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of the forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels. He stood there for a moment, straining his eyes, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. It was only when he looked down that he noticed the footprints. Deep, elongated marks in the frost, as if something with long limbs had passed through recently. But the odd thing was, they didn't seem to go anywhere. They appeared to be waiting, almost as if whatever had made them had been standing there, just watching him. Paul's breath caught in his throat. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave the forest and never return. But he couldn't. He was a ranger. This was his duty. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching over the snow, following the tracks deeper into the woods. The whispers began again, soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be calling to him, beckoning him further. The trees grew denser, the canopy above thickening, blocking out what little moonlight remained. The air grew colder, the frost biting at his skin as he pushed on. Then, just beyond the reach of his flashlight, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a figure, standing motionless against the trunk of one of the tallest trees. Paul froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and thin, almost skeletal. Its face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at him, unblinking. Its limbs were long and twisted, the joints bending in ways that were wrong, that defied nature. Paul's stomach churned. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his body frozen in terror. The figure did not move. It only stared, its hollow gaze locked on him with an intensity that sent waves of dread through him. The whispers grew louder, now filling his ears, their language indecipherable, a cacophony of voices all clamoring for his attention. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The world seemed to shrink around him, the trees closing in, the darkness pressing in on his chest. The figure finally stirred, its head tilting ever so slightly, as if studying him, its dark eyes never leaving his face. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. You shouldn't have come back." Paul's blood ran cold. The voice was wrong. Too many voices, layered on top of each other, all whispering in unison. But one voice stood out, the one that seemed to echo in his mind. He stumbled back, the flashlight falling from his hand and spinning across the ground, the beam catching the figure in strange, jerky movements. The creature's long fingers twitched, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it began to move toward him, its feet dragging along the earth. A wave of nausea hit Paul, the air thickening with the smell of rot and decay. "Go. Now." The creature's voice was clear now, its words seeping into his mind like poison. With a final, strangled cry, Paul turned and ran. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him through the forest, over the snow-covered ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each step, as if the trees themselves were alive, watching him, waiting for him to fall. He could hear the scraping of claws against bark, the dragging sound growing closer. His flashlight flickered, its beam casting wild shadows across the trees. His pulse raced, and for a moment, he thought he saw something darting between the trunks, shapes, figures, eyes glowing in the dark. His mind was a blur of panic and terror as he pushed himself harder, his boots slipping on the icy ground. He had to reach the ranger station. He had to. But the forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around him, the night becoming an oppressive weight that threatened to crush him. He stumbled forward, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground with a sharp grunt. Pain shot through his side as he pushed himself up, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The whispers were deafening now, 1,000 voices calling his name, urging him to stop, to turn around. "Paul," the voice was Sarah's again, faint, distorted, like a whisper on the wind. "You're too late." He felt the ground shift beneath him, as if the earth itself was moving. He reached the clearing, the ranger station just ahead, its lights flickering like a dying star. The gate was open, the chain hanging loosely from the post. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted through the gate, his legs burning, his chest heaving. The station's door was unlocked, and he slammed it shut behind him, leaning against it, gasping for breath. But even inside, the whispers did not stop. They echoed through the walls, the trees outside pressing in closer, as if the forest was trying to reach him. The air grew cold again, and Paul could feel something standing just beyond the door, waiting. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for certain: the forest had never let go of Pine Ridge. And now, neither had he. The creature, the forest, it was all one, a single living thing, and it was patient. It would wait for him, just like it had waited for Sarah. Story 7. I've been a park ranger for 27 years, and I have seen people wander off trails never to return. I've found bones bleached white like river stones with teeth marks too wide to be natural. I've heard screams echo across the ridges when no one else is supposed to be out there. I've found tents torn from the inside, boots filled with blood, and no sign of the person who wore them. I've seen claw marks on steel doors and trees carved with symbols that aren't in any language I've ever seen. But nothing I've encountered comes close to what happened on the east side backcountry perimeter 2 winters ago, during the deep freeze, the kind of cold that makes your breath snap in the air and your skin split just from walking too long. When the trails vanish under snowdrifts and even the wolves stay buried in their dens, when it's so quiet out there you can hear the ice groaning beneath itself, like the earth is trying to breathe. In that year we'd had 3 disappearances in S. Many weeks, solo hikers, experienced, always near the same stretch of pine between mile markers 39 and 44. And the reports didn't make any damn sense because the tracks just stopped. I mean clean stops, no struggle, no detour. Just boot prints in the snow leading into a clearing and then nothing, like the person vanished into thin air. And I was out with a guy named Jeff from Wildlife Control. Good man, solid nerves. We were tracking a mountain lion reported by some campers near the south base. And we were headed eastward to check the ravine by Deer Skull Hollow when we saw smoke. Not a lot, just a thin ribbon rising into the pale sky from somewhere ahead, too far from any known camps. And when we radioed it in, dispatch got static so thick it sounded like a waterfall, even though the channel had been clean all morning. And Jeff, And I looked at each other and didn't say anything because we'd both heard it, the voice and the static, just under the hiss, like someone whispering with their mouth full of broken glass. And we pushed forward anyway, because you don't leave a possible fire unreported, especially not in these woods. And the trees started getting weird around mile 42. I mean, really weird. Spaced too evenly, like they'd been planted that way on purpose. And their trunks had these long, vertical gashes, dozens of them, like something had clawed its way through the bark over and over again. And we found fur stuck to some of it, but it wasn't any animal I'd seen. Long, and black and oily, almost like wet feathers. And when we found the cabin, because that's what the smoke was coming from, it wasn't on any map, not even the 1963 topographic set we keep in archives. Just sitting there in a little clearing like it had grown out of the snow. Logs all rotten, but somehow standing, windows fogged but not broken, and the door open just a crack like it was waiting for us. And the whole place smelled like mold and sulfur and the kind of copper tang that sets your teeth on edge. And Jeff said he didn't want to go in, but I told him we had to check for squatters or survivors or anything that might explain what we were seeing. And the second I stepped through the threshold, I knew something was wrong. Not wrong like someone hiding in the dark, not wrong like a bear den or a meth lab, but wrong like the walls had been listening, like something ancient was pretending to be a house. And inside it was colder than outside despite the fire smoldering in the stone hearth, low and greasy with flames that burned the wrong color, not yellow or orange, but this pale blue-green like swamp gas. And there were footprints in the dust, dozens of them, circling the room over and over, too small for adult boots, more like a child's. But barefoot, and Jeff saw the pictures nailed to the walls, Polaroids, hundreds of them, each one showing the same thing, the tree line behind the cabin, same angle every time, but the shadows were different, and in some of them, you could make out a figure standing between the trees, always closer in each photo, like it had been watching the cabin for a long, long time. And I saw Jeff start to shake, just tremble all over, and he said something wasn't right with the time. Kept pointing at his watch, but the hands were spinning backwards so fast the glass cracked. And that's when we heard the knocking, not from the door, but from under the floorboards, soft at first, then harder, rhythmic, like something was crawling in. Circles beneath the cabin, and I swear to God it started to say our names, in two voices, his and mine, over and over, like it was remembering how to speak. And I grabbed Jeff, and we backed out into the snow, and the trees had moved. I don't care how insane it sounds. They were closer. The whole clearing had shrunk, like the forest was trying to fold us into itself, and the path we came down was gone, nothing but thickets where the trail had been. And the sun, the damn sun, hadn't moved an inch since we found the cabin, even though we'd been out there for hours. And then I saw it, standing just at the edge of the tree line where the shadows were thickest, too tall, thin as a scarecrow made of wet bones, no face. Just a long stretch of skin pulled tight where eyes and a mouth should be. And it raised one long finger and pointed toward the cabin, and the door slammed shut behind us even though there was no wind, and Jeff screamed. I mean really screamed, the kind of scream that tears something out of you. And he turned and ran before I could stop him, straight into the woods, and I followed, but I couldn't find him. I tracked his prints until they just stopped, clean again, no sign of struggle, no drag marks, just gone. And I radioed and got nothing, just more static, and that same whispering, clearer now, like it was right next to me. And I made it back to the station near dawn the next day, even though it should have taken less than 2 hours, frostbitten, exhausted, rambling about things I couldn't explain. And they searched for Jeff for weeks. Dogs, drones, helicopters, nothing, not a single clue. And they shut that section of the park down due to avalanche risk. But there was no snow slide, no quake, just silence. And sometimes I still dream about that cabin, about those photos, and I wake up with the taste of ashes in my mouth and a ringing in my ears like distant knocking. And the worst part, the thing I can't shake, is that a few months ago I got a new report. Hiker went missing near marker 43, and the prints they found in the snow? Just one set, barefoot, small, circling in the snow, again and again and again. Story 8. I never thought the silence would be what haunted me most, not the bodies we found hollowed out like tree stumps or the missing campers whose names I still remember even though the brass tells me not to. Not the blood trails that led uphill or the radios that kept turning on by themselves playing voices that didn't belong to anyone I'd ever met. No, it's the silence, that deep, bone-sick quiet that sinks into your skull like water into drywood. That comes back to me at night when the wind presses against my windows like it's trying to whisper something through the glass, because I used to think the woods were quiet because they were peaceful, but now I know they're quiet because something is listening, and what happened last October is what finally broke me. What drove me out of those woods and into the bottle and the therapist chair and the sleepless nights. And if I tell this wrong, if I forget even one part, I know I'll hear it again, breathing just behind my door, because that thing doesn't want to be forgotten. It wants stories. It feeds on memory. So I'll tell it straight. I'll tell it whole, just like it happened, even if the telling feels like pulling out my own teeth. And it started with a call from dispatch about a series of overlapping 911 pings from within the southern perimeter of the park, a dead zone with no cell towers, no cabins, and no marked trails. And when I asked how phones were pinging in an area with no coverage, they told me the signals weren't from phones, not really, just GPS anomalies that mimicked phones calling out, coordinates calling for help like digital ghosts, and I was the closest on rotation, assigned to investigate, solo of course, because we were short-staffed and no one wanted to buddy up after what happened last season when Reese walked into a patch of fog and never came out, and I took the old Jeep down the fire road, parked at the base of the ridge near where the pings were triangulated, checked in one last time, and then hiked in under a sky so gray it looked like stretched skin, the trees bare and crooked like arthritic fingers, and every so often I'd hear what sounded like static, not in my radio, but in the woods themselves. Like the trees were picking up a frequency that didn't belong here, and about 3 miles in I found something that stopped me cold, a tint that hadn't been there a week ago, a brand new dome tint, bright red like a vein in the snow, zipped shut, undisturbed, no. Footprints, no signs of animal activity, but inside were clothes still warm, a backpack with a water bottle that hadn't frozen, and a journal with a single entry written in smeared pencil. It followed us from the creek. It knows names. We gave it yours. And I dropped the journal and backed away, drawing my sidearm without realizing it, because the air had changed, thickened, gone still like a held breath, and I heard my name, not shouted, but whispered from beneath the snow, like something was buried alive and calling up through the ice. And when I turned to leave, the trail I'd broken getting there was gone, snow perfectly smooth as if I'd never come through at all, and I should have panicked, should have screamed, but something deeper than fear wrapped around my spine and kept me silent, a pressure in my ears like I was underwater, and the trees started to shift, not physically, not like walking or bending, but subtly, impossibly, their positions changing when I blinked. The forest reorienting itself behind my back, and I walked for what felt like hours, maybe days, the sky never changing, time becoming liquid, my watch ticking backward and then stopping altogether, and then I saw it, not a creature, not exactly, more like the impression of something vast and ancient moving just behind the visible world, like a ripple in the fabric of space, a bulge where something huge pressed too close to reality, and it had eyes, not two, but dozens. Black and wet like drowned stars, scattered in a pattern that made my mind itch, and it opened something not a mouth, but a wound in the air, and I heard every name I'd ever known myself by, from childhood to now, and I felt it take them, like it was harvesting my identity piece by piece, stripping me of who I was, and I ran, screaming into the dark, not knowing which way was out, and the woods began to echo with voices, not mine, not just mine, but all the missing hikers, the old rangers. The people whose files were quietly closed by the Park Service, whispering in unison, "We told you not to come here." And I stumbled into a clearing with a single black tree in the center, twisted and scorched and humming, literally humming like it was plugged into a power line, and nailed to its trunk were ranger badges, hundreds of them, all from stations like mine, names I recognized, faces I'd shared campfires with, all gone, all claimed, and at the base of the tree was a mirror, old and cracked. Its surface moving like water, and when I looked in, I didn't see myself. I saw that thing, that massive unseen presence blinking all its terrible eyes and mouthing something I couldn't hear but understood anyway, "You're mine now." And I woke up 3 days later in the ranger station bunk room with frostbite on 3 fingers and a throat full of dirt. No memory of how I got back. And the tent? Gone. Never found. The journal? Disappeared. Even my own gear was different, like it had been replaced, subtly wrong, the colors slightly off, the stitching unfamiliar, and worst of all, no one acted like I'd been missing. They swore I was just on a normal overnight patrol, that I'd checked in twice, once in the morning and once before bed, with audio logs to prove it. But I don't remember any of that. I remember the eyes in the mirror and the sound of something old learning my name, and sometimes the radio clicks on by itself at night and plays those logs. Only now when I listen, the voice isn't mine. It's close, it's almost me, but it drags the words out too long, like it's trying to remember how a human voice works. And last week I found a new journal under my bunk. Same smeared pencil, one line. "We told it about your family too." And that night I heard my daughter's voice coming from the trees outside, calling for help in that same underwater whisper. And I don't know how long I have before it comes back. Before I forget who I am again, before I'm just another name nailed to that black tree. But if you're reading this, if you're hearing this, don't go past marker 47. Don't answer your radio if it calls you by name, and above all else, if you find a mirror in the woods, never, ever look into it. Story 9. They told me when I started this job that the woods had their own rules, their own rhythms, that the deeper you went, the less the land belonged to people and the more it listened to older things, ancient things. And I laughed because I thought it was hazing or folklore or just the kind of creepy poetry old rangers used to scare rookies. But now I know they were warning me. Now I know they were trying to say it without saying it, because once you speak it outright, it knows you see it. And if it knows you see it, then it begins to look at you. And once it looks at you, it does not look away. And I should have listened better, should have paid attention to the way none of the senior rangers would take assignments near Devil's Jaw Hollow, or how they leave offerings near the oldest trees, or how they never, ever whistled while walking the trails, because I was cocky, fresh out of training, eager to prove I could handle my own route. And it started small, like most things that want to eat you from the inside out. It started with the trees growing too close together, even in places the forest maps showed as clearings, like the terrain itself was folding inward, and I told myself it was erosion or misprinting. Even when the GPS showed my position circling in place, even though I was hiking a straight line, even when I came across my own boot prints only 10 minutes into a 4-mile hike, I told myself it was just a glitch, a mistake. I didn't want to believe the woods could move. When I wasn't looking, and then I started finding things, ranger tags rusted to nothing on branches 20 feet above ground, ID cards that should have been retired decades ago left in tree hollows like offerings, and worse, tents half submerged in moss like the ground had grown up around them, and every single one of them had claw marks on the inside of the fabric, never the outside, like whoever was in there was trying to scratch their way out. And the radios would buzz with static shaped, like breathing, long and slow, matching my pace when I walked and slowing when I froze, and the trees began to whisper my name not out loud, but in the way the wind moved between the branches, soft and insistent, and I kept going back, like a fool. Like a moth bumping into a light it can't understand, because I had to know. And the deeper I went, the more the forest stopped pretending, the birds stopped chirping even when I played calls from my phone, the squirrels froze mid-run like statues when I passed. And the deeper I hiked, the more I saw strange things stitched into the bark, not carvings, not graffiti, but actual sinew, twisted into symbols that made my head hurt if I stared too long, like a language made from pain, and I began to lose time. Sometimes hours, sometimes days, until I started leaving notes on my arms with Sharpie to remind me what I was doing. But even those would blur or vanish altogether, as if my skin itself didn't want to remember. And then came the voices, not over radio, but inside the trees, Behind the rocks, under the frozen creek bed, voices of people I knew were dead, former rangers who'd gone missing, old hikers whose names were etched in stone at the visitor center memorial, their voices cheerful, casual, telling me to come deeper, to stop turning back, to rest beneath the roots because it's safer there. And I tried to ignore it, tried to report it, but every time I wrote something down, the reports would come back blank. The audio would be nothing but wind, the photos just static or pictures of myself asleep on the forest floor, even when I swear I was standing upright when I took them. And I started having dreams of tunnels made of bark and teeth, and of a moon that opened like an eye and wept sap onto the soil. And I would wake up with my boots wet and my nails filled with dirt I didn't recognize. And then I found the cabin. A place that didn't exist on any map, tucked between boulders too large to have moved there naturally. Its boards blackened not by fire, but by something older, something that grew rot rather than burned. And inside was a chair facing a mirror with no reflection, and a journal full of entries signed by me that I had no memory of writing, pages and pages of looped, frantic handwriting saying it's wearing me. I'm watching through its eyes now. It's learning to smile. And I ran like I was a kid again, chased by shadows I'd named monsters, but this time the shadows chased back. This time they had form and speed and sound, a clicking that sounded like bones tapping together, a laugh like bark peeling off a dead tree. And I made it back to the trailhead and collapsed just as the sun rose, except it didn't rise, not really, just sort of hovered at the edge of the horizon like it was waiting for something. And when I got back to the ranger station, they told me I'd only been gone an hour, that the call I made never came through, that I was scheduled for desk duty and had never even signed out gear. But my hands were blistered from holding the rifle and my pants were torn from something with claws. And when I checked the photos on my phone, they were all of me, asleep, deep in the woods, and in the background of each one, behind the trees, there was a figure growing closer, wearing a ranger uniform that looked just like mine. And it took me weeks to realize it was mine, and then I saw it again, in real life this time, just off the trail, standing too still, not breathing, not blinking, just watching, and it started to copy me, step for step, blink for blink. And when I shouted at it, it opened its mouth and spoke in my exact voice, not just the sound but the thought, like it stole it from my skull as I formed it. And that night, I burned my uniform and called in sick and drank myself into a blackout, but the next morning my boots were covered in forest soil and my throat tasted like moss. And I found another journal entry in my own handwriting that said, I went back last night. I wanted to feel the roots. I let it back in. And now I don't know if I'm me anymore. I don't know if I'm the thing that came out or the husk it left behind to walk among the people I used to know. And I keep seeing myself reflected in windows and catching expressions I don't recognize. And I think the forest lets some of us leave, but only after it's eaten what it needs and stitched the rest into something that can walk and talk and breathe just enough to pass. And I know this because my reflection smiled at me today. And I didn't. Story 10. They warned me when I took the job that there were parts of the forest you didn't patrol after dark. That there were stretches of trail that looped back on themselves no matter how far you walked, and old fire towers that never made it onto the official maps but still broadcast a signal in the dead of night. And I thought it was the usual ranger folklore. The kind of campfire garbage passed down to rookies to keep them on edge, to make the long cold nights feel haunted when the real threat was exposure, dehydration, getting lost or mauled, or falling into a ravine. But that was before I got assigned to District Echo, a remote section of wilderness tucked between two ridge lines where the trees grow too close together and the light never fully touches the ground even at noon, where compasses fail and the maps don't match and the birds don't sing. And on my first week there I found a shoe nailed to a tree 20 feet up, a child's shoe, faded pink with one white lace, and when I looked around I found another in a different tree, and then another, and another, always just one shoe, never a pair, hanging like rotten fruit in a forest that felt too quiet, too old, like it had grown tired of pretending it belonged to this world. And I asked the other rangers, and they just looked at each other and shook their heads and said, don't ask about the shoes, don't take them down, and above all, don't follow the smell of fire if you don't see smoke. And I laughed then, because what else could I do? What else would you do when people start talking like that? But the laughter stopped the night I stayed in Tower 6 alone and woke up to the sound of breathing coming from under the floorboards. Not animals, not wind, but slow and what like lungs that hadn't been used in a long time. And when I shined my flashlight into the cracks, there was nothing, just the old groaning wood and dust and a faint smell like wet leaves and old meat. And I told myself it was the storm, just the wind, just the dark playing tricks. But then came the knocking, soft at first, a polite rhythm on the trapdoor that led to the crawl space, and I didn't move, didn't speak, just laid in the cot staring at the ceiling as the knocking got louder, more insistent, until finally it stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something slide across the floor below me like a wet hand dragging through leaves, and in the morning everything looked normal, no prints, no damage, no sign anything had been there at all, but the trapdoor was unlatched, and after that, things changed, not all at once, but slowly, subtly, like rot in the walls of a house you can't see until it's too late, and I started finding ranger badges deep in the woods. Some so old they didn't match any of the park's issued designs, some still sticky with something dark and foul, and I started hearing voices on the radio that didn't belong to anyone on duty, soft and whispering like they were calling from underwater, always, asking the same question, "Why did you leave us?" And then the animals began to change, first in numbers, then in behavior. Deer with empty sockets that walked in circles around the towers, foxes that screamed like infants, and one night I saw a bear standing at the edge of my patrol light, watching, unmoving. Too tall, too still, like it was wearing the idea of a bear as a costume, and behind its black glass eyes I saw something turning, something wrong, and I stopped sleeping, stopped talking much, started writing everything down in case I forgot what was real, because I was forgetting things, whole days at a time, and once I woke up 3 miles from my post, naked, covered in mud and pine needles, and a crude circle of stones around me like I'd made a nest or been laid there by something that thought it was a bed. And then the dream started, of fire towers burning in reverse, the smoke falling down instead of up, and of children's voices echoing from deep in the forest, chanting my name like a nursery rhyme, and I'd wake up with ash on my tongue and fingerprints on my ankles. And the worst of it came after I followed a trail that wasn't on any map, a narrow path marked only by broken twigs and symbols carved into bark that bled when I touched them. And I walked for hours until the trees bent away from a clearing that held a single stump in the center, massive and blackened. And on that stump was a pile of ranger uniforms folded neatly with name tags I recognized, rangers I'd trained with, laughed with, who'd gone off grid, or resigned, or transferred, but whose eyes I now see in the dark when I blink too long. And on top of the pile was a mirror, old and cracked and fogged over with breath that wasn't mine. And when I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw a tower burning in the distance, a sky the color of dried blood, and a forest that was no longer made of trees but of people, grown and twisted into trunks and limbs and screaming mouths hidden in the canopy, and the sound that came from the mirror wasn't words but a hum, deep and low, like the engine of a dead god turning over beneath the soil. And I ran harder than I ever have, not from a thing but from a knowing. From the sudden awful clarity that this place wasn't a park or a forest or even part of our world but a threshold, a place that needed to be watched not to protect it from people but to protect people from it. And when I got back to base, no one believed me. They said Tower 6 hadn't been used in years, that I wasn't assigned there, that the reports I filed didn't exist and my logbook was empty, and I started to wonder if I'd ever gone there at all, if I'd always been there, and maybe I'd been watching myself this whole time from the inside out, waiting to wear this skin long enough for someone else to take my place, because last night I woke up in a new tower, one I didn't remember climbing into, with a fire burning on the horizon that no one else could see, and this morning there was a message carved into the wall above my cot in handwriting I don't recognize that says, "Do not let them in when they knock, even if they wear your face," and my reflection has started moving just a half second behind me, not enough to notice unless you're looking close. But now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it, and I think it's waiting. I think it's getting closer. and I think the forest is done pretending to be patient. Story 11. They told me the wilderness keeps its own secrets, that the deeper you go, the more it keeps from you, until eventually it keeps you. And I never understood what that meant until I was stationed at Grey Rock Ridge, a place too remote for tourists and too quiet for comfort, where the trees grow so close together the sky disappears and the silence is never truly silent, only muffled, like something is listening too closely and doesn't want to be heard. And I remember my first night in Tower 11, a crooked old watch post leaning against the hill like it was tired of standing, the radio hissing static even though I was assured the weather was clear, and sometime after midnight I heard what I thought was laughter echoing up the trail, far off, tinny, like it came from an old tape recorder left playing in the woods, and I figured it was campers, maybe drunks fooling around. But when I called it in, dispatch just said no one was scheduled in that area, no permits, no vehicles logged, and something about the way the operator said it, not confused, not curious, just cold, made the hair on my arms lift like they knew something I didn't, and that's when the lights started showing up. Flickers of movement between trees that didn't belong to any flashlight or lantern. Small blue pinpricks that floated low to the ground then vanished when I stepped off the trail, and I followed one once, just one, thinking maybe it was a reflection or someone messing around, but within minutes I was somewhere I didn't recognize, surrounded by tree trunks that curved in on themselves like ribs around a stomach, and the air tasted wrong, like metal and mildew, and when I turned back, the trail was gone, not overgrown or hidden, just gone. And I stood there for what felt like an hour, the compass needle spinning lazily, the GPS blinking error in red letters, and I only found my way back because I started to smell something burning, like old cloth or hair, and I followed it until I found Tower 11 again, except now it had claw marks down the wooden door and all the windows were covered from the inside with newspaper pages that hadn't been there before, and when I went in, the pages were blank, just old paper yellowed with time. And I stayed awake until morning with the door locked and the rifle in my lap, and from then on I knew not to follow the lights, no matter how much they called to me, no matter how much they sometimes sounded like people I used to know, calling my name in a voice that wasn't quite right. And the animals started acting wrong too, deer walking in perfect circles for hours with their heads tilted completely sideways, coyotes gathering just out of sight and staring in perfect stillness without blinking. And one morning I found a raccoon nailed to the tree outside the tower, its eyes replaced with smooth black stones and its mouth sewn shut with wire, and from that day on something changed in the air, like the forest had noticed me noticing it, and it didn't like being seen, didn't like being questioned, and every time I left the tower, I'd find strange shapes drawn into the frost on the windows, not with fingers, but like the glass had grown the patterns from the inside. Delicate spirals and intersecting lines like maps of places that shouldn't exist, and I stopped sleeping because the dreams were getting too vivid. Dreams of endless tunnels made of knotted roots where hands reached through the bark to pull me forward, and sometimes I woke up with dirt in my mouth and scratches across my chest like I'd been crawling, not dreaming. And then I started seeing the man in the hat, always at a distance, wearing an old park ranger uniform faded almost gray, just standing between the trees, never moving. And he didn't look like a man exactly, too long in the arms, too still in the head, like he was holding his breath every time I looked at him, and I'd blink and he'd be gone. But sometimes he'd be closer, always closer than before. And once I saw him reflected in the tower window, even though there was no one behind me, and I started to hear static coming through the radio at all hours, even when it was off. Soft hissing followed by brief, clipped voices saying things like, "It's feeding again," or, "He's almost ready," and I stopped trusting my eyes because the maps kept changing, trails disappearing or reappearing overnight, and the tower stairs would creak like someone was climbing up when I knew I was alone. And when I finally told someone, a supervisor who'd been in the service for 20 years, he just stared at me and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" And when I nodded, he looked down and said, "Don't let him wear your face," then transferred out the next day, left without a word. And I haven't heard from him since, and now I'm alone again, the only ranger left for miles, and the logs don't make sense anymore, dates out of order, entries I don't remember writing, and in one of them it says, in my handwriting, "Let it in. The forest is colder from the inside, and the man in the hat isn't watching from the trees anymore. He's in the mirror, he's standing in my reflection, he's smiling in my skin, and sometimes I hear my own voice speaking to the animals, to the birds that won't fly away, to the creatures that gather near the tower like parishioners at a sermon, and I think I've been here longer than I remember because the moon keeps rising in the same place and the sun never gets higher than the ridge." And when I finally built up the nerve to call out for help, I realized the radio tower had been snapped in half like a twig and something had stacked the pieces into a spiral in the clearing behind the station. And now I dream of the man in the hat stepping out of me like I'm just a suit, just a skin, and I wake up with my boots on backwards and my mouth full of moss, and the lights are everywhere now, hovering in the windows, drifting through the bunkhouse, pooling in the corners of my eyes, and I know they're waiting, all of them waiting for me to forget which one of us is real, waiting for me to stop pretending that I haven't already let him in, because some nights I look down and I'm wearing the old gray uniform, the one no one's worn in decades, and I feel tall, and still, too still, and I think maybe I've already left. Maybe I'm just the echo that stayed behind. Story 12. They don't train you for this. They don't mention it in the orientation or the handbook or the long-winded safety briefings they make you sit through when you sign on as a park ranger. When you think your biggest concern will be lost hikers or forest fires or poachers or the occasional black bear too used to people. But I learned quickly, painfully, that there are things older than roots and colder than rivers hiding in the bones of the woods. Things that don't move so much as they unfold, that don't breathe so much as they echo. And I first felt it in Broken Pine Reserve, a chunk of state forest up north near the mountains where fog moves like it's alive and the trees all lean just a little too much to one side as if something deep beneath the soil is exhaling. And when I got transferred there I thought I'd struck gold, remote but beautiful, all green ridges and quiet lakes, with more trees than people and a cozy little station cabin to myself. But I was wrong, and I knew I was. Wrong my second night there when I heard a voice outside at 2 a.m., clear as day, calling hey, soft and curious, just once, and when I went to the window with my flashlight, nobody was there, just fog, thick enough to smother the world. And when I stepped out the front door, something crunched under my boot, and I looked down and found a set of teeth, not animal, but human, set into the soil like they'd grown there. No blood, no root, just clean white molars poking out of the earth like daisies. And I stood frozen while something whistled from the trees, long and slow and wrong, like lungs too deep in the chest and a mouth too wide to shape a human tune. And I backed inside and locked the door and pretended I hadn't heard it, pretended I hadn't seen it, and told myself it was just a dream brought on by solitude and too much caffeine. But the next day I checked the trail cams and found the recordings from midnight to 4 a.m. were all corrupted, just static and the occasional flash of movement too fast to identify, but always vertical, always tall. And later that week I hiked out to the old creek loop to check a report of a collapsed bridge and found the entire span was gone, not broken, not crumbled, just missing. Like it had been scooped clean out of the earth and replaced with a gash in the land filled with stagnant water that reflected nothing, not me, not the trees, just a flat black surface with ripples moving against the wind. And when I leaned down to inspect it, I saw a face surface for a split second, not mine, not even human, just a mouth stretched ear to ear across skin the color of mildew, and then it was gone. And I backed away fast, slipped, cracked my elbow on a rock, and swore I heard something laugh beneath the water, like it had been watching me try to understand. And from that moment on, I started to notice more. The trees grew in spirals in some places, curling inward like they were being pulled into a drain. Birdsong stopped every time I entered certain clearings, and I'd find deep gouges in the dirt like something had been dragged, long, narrow trenches filled with hair and bones I didn't recognize. And once I found a shoe nailed to a stump, a child's shoe, soaked in something black that smelled like ammonia and rot, and I brought it back to the station against every instinct I had, thinking maybe I could match it to a missing person report. But when I turned around the second time, the shoe was gone, and in its place was a pine cone filled with teeth, the same teeth from the night before. And I didn't sleep that night, couldn't, because the walls kept creaking and the wind kept sounding like voices that said things like, "You're almost ready," and "It wants your eyes," and "Who do you think you are, wearing his skin like that?" And I thought maybe it was a psychotic break, that the isolation was melting my brain. But then I started getting calls on the radio that no one else could hear, static. Then breathing, then a voice that sounded like me asking for help from somewhere far away, asking me to come find him. And it wasn't until I heard my own voice scream that I realized it wasn't coming through the radio at all, but from under the cabin floorboards. And when I pried them open, I found a shallow pit dug into the dirt below, lined with shredded ranger uniforms and bones, so many bones, and at the bottom was a mirror, round, cracked, and caked in mud. And when I looked into it, I saw Tower 4, the one that burned down 10 years ago in a lightning storm, standing tall and intact, with someone inside staring out, and they waved at me, slow, like they knew I'd been watching. And then the glass shattered from the inside and I ran, sealed the floor, and tried to forget, but the dreams wouldn't let me. Dreams of walking through the woods with no face, dreams of being buried up to my neck while trees whispered my name and licked my ears with tongues made of moss. And eventually I stopped sleeping at all, started keeping the lights on, and I told myself I'd make it to the end of the season and quit, never look back. But the forest had other plans, and I started finding footprints outside the station every morning, barefoot, long, toes too wide apart. And once I woke up with my boots on the roof, neatly placed side by side like someone had taken them off me while I slept, and then waited. And now when I check the cameras, there's someone in them, far off in the tree lane. Getting closer each night, a figure with a blank face and an old ranger's badge on its chest that reads Kane, my last name. And I don't remember posing for the pictures, but I'm there in them too, watching myself from behind. And yesterday, I tried to drive out, but the road looped back to the station 4 times, and on the 5th loop I saw myself parked there, sitting calmly at the desk, writing in the logbook. And when I stared in the window, he looked up and smiled with too many teeth. And now I don't know if I'm still me, or just the latest echo of whatever the forest wants to wear, because sometimes I catch my reflection moving out of sync. Sometimes I hear myself laughing from under the bed, and when I touch the trees, they're warm like skin, like they'd been waiting for a new face to wrap around. And now I understand the warning carved into the cabin wall under a layer of paint I scraped away in desperation. 7 words written in something dark and dry. The forest remembers what you forget, and I think it's remembering me piece by piece. Story 13. They sent me up to Black Hollow as part of the Firewatch rotation, just a seasonal gig, nothing serious. Hike the trails, log animal sightings, watch for smoke on the horizon, maybe scare off the occasional hiker who thinks the warning signs don't apply to them. And I figured it'd be the easiest few months of my life. I mean, how hard could it be to sit in a tower and stare at trees, right? But nobody mentioned that Black Hollow wasn't on any standard maps. Nobody told me that the locals refused to say its name aloud, just called it the place past the ridge, and looked down at their shoes when I asked for directions. And the first thing I noticed when I got there was the silence, not peaceful silence, but a suffocating, heavy sort of stillness, like even the wind didn't want to make noise, like the forest had sucked all the sound into itself and was holding its breath, waiting for something. And the air smelled wrong too, like copper and mushrooms, sweet and rotting all at once. And when I first stepped into Tower 7, my home for the season, I felt like I'd walked into a room that remembered other people better than it remembered itself, because everything inside was off by an inch, the bed bolted crooked, the window frame warped, the nails rusty even though the station had supposedly been rebuilt last spring. And on the first night I dreamed of trees that moved, bending over like they were trying to listen, their bark pulsing like veins under skin. And when I woke up gasping, I found a set of muddy footprints circling the tower, barefoot, huge, clawed, and far too deep to be left by anything I knew of. And I radioed base to ask about animal activity, but got nothing but static and a faint whisper that sounded like my name spoken backward. And when I tried to report it the next day, The logbook I'd written it in was gone, replaced with a different one, older, yellowed, filled with entries I didn't recognize, written in shaky script that looked like mine but talked about things I hadn't seen yet. Things like the pale figure in the lake that floats just beneath the surface with its mouth wide open and eyes full of mud, or the tree that grows teeth at its base like it's chewing through the bones that litter the roots, or the faces that appear in the smoke when you light a fire at night, begging silently with hollow eyes and mouths too wide. And I tried to dismiss it as a prank, maybe an elaborate joke some ranger before me had pulled. But then I found the tree, exactly as described, deep in the western grove where the map said there was no path, a massive black trunk riddled with holes shaped like screaming mouths. And I reached out without meaning to, touch the bark, and it felt wet, warm, and it pulsed under my fingers like it was breathing, and something inside it moved, and I ran back to the tower, locked the door, and refused to leave for 2 days. But the dreams kept coming, more vivid every night, dreams of the tower, sinking into the earth while I sleep, dreams of my body stretched out between the trees like hide, dreams of something knocking from inside the walls, begging to be let out, and I started to notice things out of the corner of my eye, too fast to see properly but always there. Reflections that didn't match my movements, shadows without sources, faces peering from under the bed when I was alone, and once I saw myself standing at the tree line, staring up at the tower with a smile I've never made. And when I blinked, it was gone, and the next day I found my boots filled with dirt and teeth, small human teeth, all molars, still bloody, still warm, and I wanted to leave. I packed my bag and hiked back toward the trailhead, but the forest bent around me. Every direction turning back on itself, paths that didn't match the map, signs nailed to trees in languages I couldn't read, and after hours of walking I was right back at the tower, like I'd never left, and the sun didn't move in the sky. Just hung there, low and red like a swollen eye, and my watch stopped ticking, the hands rusted into place, and now I think time doesn't work here the way it should, or maybe it's just not my time, because I found a photograph in the tower drawer, black and white, showing a ranger with my face but older, gaunter, eyes hollow, standing beside the same tree that pulsed under my hand, and on the back, written in the same shaky script, were the words, "We live in the silence now." And that night I woke up with dirt in my mouth and roots wrapped around my ankles, crawling up from under the floorboards, and when I screamed, no sound came out, just a dry rasp like wine through dead leaves, and now the radio only speaks in riddles and screams. And sometimes I hear singing from the woods, sweet and soft, like a lullaby played backward underwater, and once I followed it, just once, and found a clearing with no sound, no wind, no bugs, just a massive stone altar stained dark with something old. And surrounding it were mannequins made from bark and twine, each wearing a ranger uniform, each with no face, and when I turned to run, one of them raised a hand and pointed at me, and I fell, twisted my ankle, crawled back to the tower dragging my leg through the leaves while the mannequins watched from the trees, and now I'm afraid to look in mirrors because sometimes I see something behind me, not a figure, not a person, just movement, like smoke in reverse, curling upward with fingers. And I can't sleep anymore because when I close my eyes I hear the forest whispering things it should not know, secrets I didn't even know I'd buried, my dead dog's name, the girl I left behind, the guilt I carry like a stone, and last night, I heard knocking inside my own head, like a fist against the inside of my skull, and I think something is trying to get in, or maybe trying to get out, and now the tower creaks even when there's no wind, and the stars are all wrong, constellations twisted, like bones, and I'm starting to forget things, where I came from, what my voice sounds like, the shape of my own hands, and I've begun to write things I don't remember writing, long messages carved into the walls in languages I don't know, and when I read them, my nose bleeds and my teeth ache and I can feel the trees listening, closer now, so much closer, their branches tapping at the glass like fingers, and I saw myself again last night, standing in the woods, smiling, holding something in. Its hands, a face, I think, mine, and when I turned away, the face was gone but the smile stayed in my reflection, and I know I'm not me anymore, or at least not only me, because when I speak, The words come out wrong, too many voices at once. And sometimes I cough up bark or black water or small white stones etched with symbols that disappear when touched. And now I understand the final entry in the old logbook, written in blood across the last page in block letters that jitter and shake. Even when I hold the paper still, the forest takes what it loves, and I think it loves me now. I think I've been chosen or maybe broken open just right, and the forest is inside me, filling me, making me one of its many mouths. And I'm so tired of fighting it, of pretending I'm still a man and not a mask, and tonight I will go to the tree again. I will lay down my skin and let the roots take what's left of me, because the silence is so beautiful now, and I think I can finally hear what it's been saying all along. Story 14. I took the post at Ironwood National Park because I needed the isolation, needed to disappear for a while after what happened back home, and the idea of a few months alone in the forest sounded like therapy to me. A tower in the woods, a radio, a logbook, a schedule, no people, just trees and wind and space to forget. But no one warned me what the forest there really was, what it had waiting. And it started on the first night when I climbed the tower stairs and found my reflection already, waiting in the window, not just the glass catching me late, but a version of me already standing inside looking out before I even opened the door, vanishing the moment the door creaked open like it had never been there at all. And I laughed it off as exhaustion and moved in, set up my bunk, turned on the old CB radio and scanned the frequencies, listened to Ranger Dispatch crackle out its usual welcome, but I swear I heard a second voice on the line behind the welcome, low, hoarse, saying, "You're home." And the days were quiet after that, hiking trails, marking fallen branches, watching for smoke, logging prints and scat and nests and snapped twigs like I'd been trained. But each night I came back with more than I left with, objects in my pack I didn't put there. Things like buttons, teeth, tiny dolls made of sticks tied with strands of hair that smelled like copper and pine pitch. And the dreams, God, the dreams, they were the kind you wake up from still screaming. Still have. In the place you thought you'd left, with trees growing from your mouth and roots wrapping around your ribs. And when I looked in the mirror some mornings, I swear my eyes were greener than the day before, and the whites of them had these faint pulsing lines like leaf veins. And the radio would come on by itself at exactly 3:07 a.m. each night and whisper things like, "Do you remember the pit?" And "He's still down there." And I'd find dirt under my nails and scratches across my chest I couldn't explain, and I told myself I was sleepwalking, that the isolation was messing with me. But then I saw them, deep in the woods, far past the boundary trail, the watchers, pale, too tall, too thin, bodies that flickered like bad reception. Standing still, but somehow always closer when I looked back, and I stopped reporting what I saw. I stopped writing in the logbook because something was tearing the pages out while I slept, leaving in their place pressed leaves covered in writing that wasn't mine but looked just like it, full of dates that hadn't happened yet and names I'd never said aloud but somehow felt like I should know. And the tower began to creak at night, not with the wind, but in a rhythm like footsteps circling it again and again and again. And I once heard a knock under the floor, and when I pulled up the boards I found a hole dug out with fingernails, still wet, and I swear I could see something moving at the bottom of it, a hand maybe, or a root, or both, in one night. I followed the singing. I didn't mean to. I just heard it, a woman's voice, soft and slow, like a hymn without words, and I walked out in my socks like a child in a dream and didn't even notice the cold. Didn't even notice the blood until I came to the clearing where the stone ring stood, where the trees formed a perfect circle around bare earth and bones carved into spirals and symbols that shimmered like heat waves. And standing at the center was a woman made of bark and shadow and moss, her face blank, her eyes hollow, and she held out her hand to me and said, "Your turn." And I don't remember walking back, just waking up with pine needles in my mouth and that song still echoing in my ears. And since then the birds won't come near the tower. The trail cams catch nothing but static and fog, and every photo I take comes out black except the ones I don't remember taking, which show me deep in the woods, kneeling, eyes closed, mouth open, like I'm waiting to be filled with something I can't name. And the sky turns the wrong color at dusk now, like old meat and rust, And sometimes the trees shift when I'm not looking, growing closer together, trunks bending just enough to be noticed, but not enough to run from. And I found another tower last week. One that isn't on any map, and inside it was a corpse in a ranger uniform with my name tag and my face, half rotted, half smiling, like it had been waiting for me to find it, and the walls were covered in carvings that said things. Like, he never left, and the trees remember, and when I looked up, the mirror on the ceiling showed me still standing there, but everything behind me was gone. No tower, no trees, just black water stretching forever. And when I blinked, I was outside again with no memory of how I got there and mud in my boots that smelled like blood. And now the sun doesn't rise properly anymore. It just fades in like a spotlight on a stage that isn't mine. And when I sleep, I dream of being buried alive while the forest kneels beside the hole and sings to me, tells me I've been chosen, tells me I've already become what I feared. And I see myself walking among the trees, naked, covered in moss, eyes blind but seeing. Mouth full of roots that speak in voices of every ranger who came before me. And I know I'm not the first, that the forest uses us, that the towers are lures, not sanctuaries, and I'm beginning to forget what my own voice sounds like. Beginning to feel the tower breathe when I sleep. Beginning to hear the earth calling my name in syllables too old to speak aloud. And I think soon I'll walk into the woods and not come back. And that's okay, I think, because the fear is gone now. Replaced by hunger and reverence and a peace that smells like wet soil and burning leaves. And if you ever take this post, if you ever climb this tower and read this, know that you won't leave either. Not really. Because the forest doesn't let go. Not once it knows your name. And it knows yours now. Just like it knew mine. Story 15. They assigned me to the north boundary outpost of Marrow Pine Reserve after the last ranger vanished. Just disappeared from his post like breath in winter. No signs of a struggle. No resignation letter. No gear missing. Just his last journal entry that said, "Something is walking beneath the roots now," followed by a line scratched so hard into the paper it tore the page in half. And even though every bone in my body told me to say no, to decline the reassignment, I accepted it because the official explanation was exhaustion-induced abandonment, and I needed the transfer after the incident at Echo Bluff. After the search party I led found nothing but that torn sleeping bag and the half-eaten radio, still playing static whispers. And maybe deep down I wanted the silence, the distance, a place no one dared enter without a badge or a death wish. So I drove the winding dirt roads through fog that pressed against the windshield like wet hands, past the carved warning signs and rusted gate, arrived at the outpost cabin which stood leaning like a drunk man near the foot of a granite rise, surrounded by woods so thick the sky felt like a rumor. And from the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air smelled like mildew and burnt feathers. The walls were covered in faded charcoal marks that looked like inverted tree shapes. And the inside of the windows had smears as if something had pressed its face to the glass from inside. And though the logs showed no ranger had checked in for nearly 6 weeks, the wood stove was still warm, and there were fresh pine needles on the floor, still green and wet. And that night, I barely slept, just stared at the ceiling while something paced outside, soft, deliberate steps that stopped every time I held my breath. And I told myself it was a deer or whined through the trees until I saw the hoof prints the next morning. Not deer tracks, not elk or moose or bear, but long, narrow indentations with clawed toes set too, far apart. And the spacing of the stride meant whatever made them was walking on 2 legs. And the next day, while on patrol, I found a tree unlike any I'd ever seen, gnarled and swollen with bark that looked like wrinkled skin, with dozens of bones nailed to it like crude decorations, small bones, human bones, and one femur blackened by fire still bearing the remnants of a charred ranger badge. And when I radioed the station to report it, all I got was a high-pitched tone and whispering. Underneath it, like words recorded backward on dying tape. And that night I had the dream, or what I thought was a dream, where I was buried beneath the forest floor, eyes open in the dark, lungs full of roots, as something ancient and grinning leaned over me and whispered, you're inside me now. And I woke up with soil in my mouth and dirt packed under my fingernails and a ringing in my ears that didn't stop for 3 days. And the journal left behind by the last ranger resurfaced in the cabin a week later, even though I had already sent it back with evidence services. But this time it had new pages, still damp with ink, describing me, word for word, even writing what I'd said to myself in the mirror that morning. And that night the scratching started from inside the walls, slow at first, like mice or squirrels, then faster, longer, deeper, like claws dragging across bone. And the radio began speaking when I wasn't touching it, whispering fragments of sentences in my own voice. And sometimes I saw a movement in the mirror that didn't match what I was doing. A twitch, a blink, a smile. And my reflection would lag behind just enough for me to know I wasn't alone in myself anymore. And the deeper I went into the woods, the more they changed, paths shifting behind me, trees bending in the windless air to block the way I came. And I swear I saw a tree breathe, its trunk rising and falling like a lung, groaning low like a heartbeat in the dirt, and I followed a sound one day, not footsteps, not an animal, but a slow dragging, wet and rhythmic, like something pulling its limbs through blood-soaked leaves. And when I reached the source, I found a hollow, a pit with steps carved in spiral form down the inside, and at the bottom, a totem of stitched hides and bone masks, all the faces screaming with their mouths sewn shut, and carved into the stone beneath them was my name, already worn by rain and moss, as if it had always been there. And I started waking up in different clothes, ones I didn't remember packing, smelling like ash and pine tar, and the logbook began to update itself in handwriting I couldn't recognize, sometimes in languages I didn't know, sometimes in crude pictographs that pulsed slightly on the page like ink filled with something still alive. And one night, I looked out the window and saw the woods were full of lights, not flashlights or lanterns, but eyes, dozens of them, glowing white without heat or reflection, and they blinked in unison and then disappeared all at once. And when I checked the trail cams, the footage was all gone, replaced with hours of static punctuated by frames of someone standing in the trees with their back turned, arms raised, mouth open, bleeding from the eyes. And I saw the outpost in the distance, glowing as if it were on fire. But when I turned around to look at it directly, it was just dark and still and cold. And the next morning, I found footprints made of ash around the cabin, leading into the walls. And I found a piece of paper nailed to the inside of the door I hadn't seen the night before that just said, "You are the last voice before the woods. Begin." And after that, I stopped sleeping entirely because every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear singing. Not human, not joyful, but deep and cracked and ancient, like trees humming as they die. And one morning the sun never rose. The sky just stayed dim and gray and close. And I realized the shadows were going the wrong way, pulling toward the center of the forest. And when I tried to hike out, the roads were gone. Even the ranger trails overgrown in a single night. And the GPS spun like a compass dropped on a magnet. And I think I lost days, maybe weeks, because the calendar on the wall jumped ahead. And I began to see the other rangers, or what was left of them, in glimpses, figures moving between trees, some wearing uniforms soaked in mud and bark, others crawling on all fours with their faces covered in bark like masks. And I knew if I stayed another night, I wouldn't leave, not as myself, not at all. But I couldn't find the way out, only deeper in, and now the cabin breathes. When I do, its floorboards pulse with something growing underneath. And I can feel it watching me through the wood, through my eyes, and the radio no longer crackles. It sings, it chants, and it calls itself Mother of Marrow, Father of Bark, and I've begun to repeat the words without meaning to, even when I think I'm not speaking. And last night I looked down at my hand and saw it was made of bark and moss and beetles crawling where veins used to be. And I think I am being changed into something that belongs here, something that walks under the roots and sings into the soil. And I know now the forest was never a place but a body, and I was swallowed, and there is no leaving the belly of a god. Story 16. They told me Black Hollow Reserve was one of the oldest protected forests in the state, a place so remote and undisturbed it hadn't had a permanent ranger in nearly 40 years. And when I got the assignment, I took it without hesitation because the idea of solitude, of being alone with the trees and wind and quiet, seemed like salvation after the chaos of the world I left behind, the divorce, the noise, the endless digital bleeding of people who'd forgotten how to be silent. So I packed what I needed, signed the long-term contract, and took the long gravel road out past the last radio tower until my signal died and the forest swallowed the horizon. And the further I drove, the more the road narrowed until branches scraped the truck on both sides and the light began to dim even though the sun hadn't set. And when I arrived at the Firewatch Tower, the air felt too still, like the whole forest had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. But I told myself it was just nerves, just the shift into a different kind of quiet, the kind that isn't empty but full of the space between sounds. And for the first few days, everything was fine. I patrolled the ridges, checked the animal paths, climbed the tower to log weather conditions and keep a lookout for lightning strikes or distant smoke. And the only strange thing was how often I thought I heard my name being whispered in the trees when the wind blew through them, faint and stretched like a voice underwater. And I would stop and turn, but there was never anyone there, just the shifting canopy and the occasional snap of a twig far too heavy to be from a squirrel. And I told myself it was nothing, the mind playing tricks, echoes and nerves and wind, until I started finding things in the woods that didn't belong, lengths of old rope hanging from branches like nooses, piles of stone stacked in perfect spirals that hadn't been there the day before, crude carvings on the trees of figures with no faces and antlers growing from their heads. And once I found an old ranger's hat caught high in a tree, rotted and moth-eaten and full of black feathers. And the next night, I woke to the sound of tapping on the tower window. A steady, deliberate rhythm like someone using their knuckle to knock glass. But I was on the 3rd floor, far too high for anyone or anything to reach from the ground. And when I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. Just my own reflection in the dark shapes of trees swaying. But when I turned away, I could still see the shape of a face in the window. Not mine, not anything human, long and too pale, with holes where eyes should be, and I didn't sleep that night. Just sat by the radio listening to static and the occasional fragments of speech that didn't match any channel I recognized. Voices whispering in dead air things like "the roots remember" and "don't turn around" and "he wears your face." And I started noticing things moving between the trees at dusk, not animals. Not deer or bears, but tall narrow shapes that walked upright and stopped moving if I looked directly at them, standing as still as deadwood until I blinked and they were gone. And one night I followed one, just to see, just to know. And it led me into a ravine I'd never seen on any map, where the air grew cold and wet and thick with mist that moved against the wind. And at the bottom was a door, an old rusted steel hatch half buried in the earth, pulsing with a slow heat that I could feel in my bones, and I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew, but my hand moved on its own, and the moment it cracked open, just an inch, the forest went completely silent, not quiet, silent, no birds, no wind, not even the sound of my own breathing. Like the world had paused to listen, and something exhaled from the dark below, something vast and wrong and wet. And I slammed it shut and ran until I couldn't feel my legs, and when I got back the tower door was open even though I'd locked it, and all my journals had been torn to shreds and the floor was covered in damp moss and tiny perfect footprints, not human, not animal, just wrong. And from that night forward things started to change in me. I stopped dreaming but woke up tired with blood in my mouth and dirt in my hair. I started speaking words I didn't understand into the radio without knowing why. Words like Narlin, Usk, and the Hollow Tooth. And when I caught my reflection in the mirror one morning, my eyes were the wrong color, a gray-green I'd never had, and they shimmered slightly like fish scales. And when I blinked, the reflection didn't, and I've stopped hearing birds altogether, and now the tower groans at night like it's being pulled downward. And the trees outside shift places while I sleep. I mark them now, little carvings of my own, but the same trees appear on opposite sides of the tower in the morning, like they're playing a slow game I can't understand, and I tried to leave. I really did. I packed my gear and hiked toward the access road. But no matter how long I walked, I always ended up back at the tower, even when I didn't turn around, even when I walked in a straight line using the compass and sun. And once I found myself back at the base of the tower with no memory of walking, with hours lost and my boots soaked in something thick and red that didn't smell like blood but like iron and honey and rot. And last night I found the other ranger, the one who vanished. Or what was left of him, hanging upside down in the canopy like a cocoon split open, his skin carved with hundreds of tiny glyphs that pulsed when I looked at them. And when I touched one, my ears filled with whispers and screams layered over each other, not just his voice but many, dozens maybe, all crying the same word, feed. And now I can't sleep without hearing them. Now I see things crawling on the ceiling that vanish when I blink, and my reflection has started to smile when I don't, and the radio only plays the sound of a heartbeat now, slow and deep and wrong, like it belongs to the forest itself. And the last time I tried to call for help, the only reply was my voice, echoing back with different words, saying you were always here. And I found a bone under my pillow shaped like a key, slick with something warm, and I know it fits the hatch in the ravine. And every night the forest gets louder, closer, the trees bending toward the tower like they want to press through the windows, and I've started to feel them in my blood, in my dreams, whispering secrets I don't want to understand but do. And now I don't think I'm guarding this forest at all. I think I'm part of it, a nerve ending, something growing in the brain of something older and deeper than roots. And I don't know if anyone's coming for me, but even if they did, I think the forest would eat them too, would plant them like it did me, because I hear something moving beneath the floor now, something heavy and wet and full of teeth, and it's humming, and I've started humming back. Story 17. They assigned me to Dead Elk Ridge under the pretense of forest fire monitoring and seasonal trail surveying. Though no fires had been recorded in this region for over 50 years and the trails had all been closed due to erosion hazards, which I later learned was code for the fact that hikers who entered the higher elevation paths either came back changed or didn't come back at all, and I should have turned it down, should have asked why they gave me a duty station with no clear radio contact and a tower surrounded by trees older than the oldest record on the logging manifest. But I didn't ask, not because I was brave, but because I'd grown tired of civilization and its noise, and something in me longed for stillness, for distance, for a place without people. So I took the long drive up the winding gravel switchbacks into the high country where the trees stood too straight and the wind blew in circles. And the moment I stepped out of my truck at Tower 9, I knew I'd crossed into a place that was waiting for me, not in a welcoming way, but the way prey waits under the snow for the wolf to come. And the cabin itself was crooked and smelled of resin and mold. The bed still made from the last ranger's stay 2 years prior. The sheets clean, but the pillow indent still fresh like he'd gotten up only yesterday. And though his name had been scratched off every official log, I found the cover of his field journal buried under a floorboard, the pages torn out in one word, burned into the leather, R-O-B-L-O-D, and I laughed it off, chalked it up to a loner's breakdown, until I hiked up the northern firebreak trail and found the trees had grown together into an unnatural canopy, their limbs interwoven in a spiral pattern like a knot in time, and deep within that dark corridor stood a wooden totem with antlers and empty eye sockets, covered in shreds of ranger uniforms wrapped around it like offerings. And I took one picture before my camera lens shattered from inside, and that night the wind carried a smell like rotting bark and iron, and when I opened the tower window I saw lights moving through the forest, too high to be lanterns, too steady to be fireflies. And they moved in deliberate lines as if patrolling the woods below me, and though I told myself they were tricks of the eyes, the next morning I found deep footprints in a circle around the base of the tower, not boot prints, not animal. Just long gouges in the mud like hooves made of stone. And over the next few days, the forest began to press inward, trees I'd marked with red tags reappearing miles from where I'd nailed them, trail signs rotting overnight, and birds vanishing altogether until the only sounds were creaking limbs and something beneath the ground, like a great hollow beast breathing under the roots. And then the dreams began, not dreams really, but visions that struck when I closed my eyes. Visions of a mouth in the earth, vast and red and wet, lined with teeth, made of splintered wood and bones, whispering to me in a language of rustling leaves and wet chewing, telling me secrets I didn't understand but woke up bleeding from the ears after hearing, and I tried to leave, took the emergency jeep down the old road, only to return to the tower after hours of driving in a straight line, the odometer turning but the landscape never changing, and each attempt left me further from what I knew is real, as if the forest was folding around me like a glove, closing around a hand, and I stopped sleeping altogether after I woke up one night halfway buried in the soil behind the tower, fingernails full of dirt and roots in my mouth, and every time I blinked I saw the faces of those who came before me. Watching from the woods, their eyes black and mouths sealed with moss, and I found more journals hidden in the walls, each one beginning normal and ending in the same scrawl, "The forest remembers its children," and I began to understand the trees. Weren't trees, not entirely, not anymore, but vessels, bones grown tall, filled with something that remembered being human and hated what it had become, and I watched as the Firewatch map began to change, new paths appearing. New symbols etched in the margins in a language that pulsed if I looked too long, and one day the radio came alive without power, whispering my name in the voice of my dead father, then my childhood dog, then a voice that sounded like mine but deeper, older. And it said, "Your skin is only bark waiting to harden," and I screamed, but no one heard, because no one was ever going to hear again, and I think the forest knew I was near the edge, because that night it showed me what it truly was, not a forest, but a wound in the world. A living scar from some ancient thing that fell from the sky or crawled up from the dark before there were names for fear, and it fed not on flesh but memory and identity, peeling away who you are until all that's left is hunger and bark and the need to kneel in the dirt and beg to be rooted, and I felt it in my veins now, sap and marrow mixing, my teeth aching as if preparing to fall out and be replaced with wooden thorns, and I could hear my bones creaking when I walked, echoing like the trees do before they fall, and I knew I was changing, not in mind, but in body, my shape no longer entirely my own, and I kept the mirrors covered because my reflection had started to smile too soon, and once it blinked when I didn't. And I knew it was ready to take over when I was too weak to resist, and then I started waking up in different places, the tower gone, the woods whispering lullabies to me in 100 voices, and I wept not from fear but from understanding. From knowing that this was never a post, never an assignment, but a ritual, a rite of consumption, and I was the offering, the latest in a line of rangers who were meant not to protect the forest, but to feed it, to become its next prophet. And the boots of the last one are still nailed to the tree outside, filled with mushrooms growing in the shape of teeth, and the wind carries my name now, but not the one I was given at birth, the one the forest gave me, the one it wrote in my blood as I slept, the one I cannot speak without choking on bark, and I know I will soon forget who I was, and that is the final gift it offers, erasure, peace, a place in the soil and sky, and as I write this with fingers I can no longer fully feel, I can hear the roots, moving beneath the tower again, closer this time, and the trees are pressing inward like ribs around a heart, and I am no longer afraid, only still, and waiting to bloom. Story 18. It was just past dusk when I first felt it, the creeping sensation, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention as I walked the winding trails of the forest, my flashlight the only source of light slicing through the thickening gloom. A silent whisper of wind rustling through the high branches above me, and that uneasy stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath, every rustle, every snap of a twig beneath my boots echoing too loudly in the silence. But it wasn't until I reached the old ranger station, abandoned for years now, that I saw it, barely a flicker in the corner of my eye, something that seemed almost human, standing motionless just outside the glow of my flashlight beam. But when I turned to look, it was gone. And I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the fatigue, the solitude getting to me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't ignore the way the shadows stretched unnaturally, creeping and crawling as if they had a life of their own. And as I stood there in front of the old station, a knot tightening in my stomach. I felt it again, a cold prickle on my skin, like someone or something was watching me, waiting, and I shouldn't have gone in. But I did, stepping through the broken door. The hinges groaning like a warning, the air inside stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, and everything was exactly as it had been when they abandoned it, papers scattered across the desk, the calendar still marked with the date they left, and that strange, lingering sense that I wasn't alone, that I never had been. And when I stepped into the back room, I noticed it then, a smear of something dark on the floor, streaking from the far corner toward the wall, and I knelt to inspect it. My heart racing as I touched it, cold and slick, not mud, not dirt, but something else entirely, and I stood up quickly, the hairs on my neck rising, the overwhelming urge to leave, but just as I turned to go, the door slammed shut. Behind me, and I spun, my flashlight catching something in the far corner, barely visible, a figure hunched over, impossibly tall and thin, its body covered in dark, matted fur, and its face, if you could call it that, was an empty void, no eyes, no nose. Just a dark, gaping hole where its face should have been, and it let out a sound, a low, guttural hiss that froze me to the spot, a sound that seemed to resonate deep in my bones, vibrating with an unnatural frequency, and I knew, without a doubt, that this thing, this creature, wasn't human, and I turned to run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled toward the door. But it was no use, the door wouldn't budge, the creature's presence growing stronger, its shadow stretching across the walls. And just as I thought I was done for, I remembered the old radio in the corner, dusty and silent for years, but maybe, just maybe, I could get a signal. I could call for help, but the moment my fingers touched the radio, the room seemed to shift, the air turning colder, heavier, and the creature was right behind me. I could feel its cold, damp breath on my neck, could hear its gurgling hiss growing louder in my ears, and my hand was shaking as I reached for the radio. But before I could press the button, the creature's long, bony fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back with a force that made my knees buckle, and I twisted, trying to break free, but it was no use, it was too strong, too fast, and as I struggled, I could see the darkness closing in on me, the room spinning, the world fading to black as the last thing I heard was the sound of that horrible, guttural hiss, louder now, almost deafening, and I thought for a moment that I was done, that this was it. But then, just as I was about to lose consciousness, I heard something else, a voice, distant, distorted, like a whisper through static, and it spoke my name. But it wasn't a voice I recognized. It was cold, foreign, and when I looked around, the creature was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving only the faintest trace of that strange, unearthly scent in the air, and I stumbled to my feet, my head spinning, my pulse racing, but I had no time to think, no time to wonder where the creature had gone. Because the forest outside had become still, too still, the kind of silence that comes right before something terrible happens, and I realized, with growing horror, that I wasn't alone in the forest, that it wasn't just the creature I had to worry about, it was the forest itself, as if it had somehow come alive, and now it was hunting me, the trees shifting, the ground beneath me trembling as the whispers in the wind grew louder, and I could hear them now, dozens of voices, soft and pleading, crying for help, begging for release, and that's when I knew. This was no ordinary place, no normal forest, it was a trap, a place that fed on fear, on souls, and I was its next victim. And as I ran, the shadows closed in around me. Every twisted branch, every rustling leaf seemed to move with purpose, following me, trapping me. And just as I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw it up ahead, the ranger station again. But this time it was different. The walls were covered in dark, dripping stains, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. And standing in front of the door, the same creature, tall, dark, faceless, stared at me. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others, more figures, all the same, tall and thin, their bodies covered in matted fur, their faces black voids, and as they took a step toward me, I realized, with sickening clarity, that this wasn't just a hunting ground for them, it was their home, and I was the prey, and I would never escape. Because the forest had claimed me, just like it had claimed all the others before me, and now, with nowhere to run, no one to hear my screams, I became just another whisper in the wind, lost forever in the dark, hungry forest that never lets go. Story 19. It was just past midnight when the storm started, the wind howling through the trees, and the rain slamming against the windows of the ranger station, louder than I had ever heard it before. And I stood there, staring out the window, watching the branches bend and twist under the force of the storm, the distant howl of an animal carried on the wind. And though I had been a park ranger for years, I had never felt this uneasy. Something about tonight felt different, like the storm wasn't just a storm, like it was trying to warn me, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the weather, nothing more, and I turned back to the fire, the crackling wood offering some comfort in the otherwise oppressive silence of the station. But that was when I heard it, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground outside, and my heart skipped a beat. I knew the area well. There were no animals that big around here, certainly not in this part of the park, so I grabbed my flashlight, checked my rifle, and stepped outside into the pouring rain, the beam of light cutting through the sheets of rain, casting strange shadows on the trees. But there was nothing but the pounding of the storm and the rhythm of my own heartbeat in my ears. And I took a step further into the woods, the ground slick and treacherous beneath my boots, my flashlight sweeping back and forth, and then I saw it, just barely, a flash of movement up ahead, too fast, too strange. But before I could react, it was gone, and I froze, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, the storm playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was out there watching me, waiting. And as I moved deeper into the woods, I heard it again, a rustling, a crackling noise, like something was moving just beyond the tree line. And I felt my grip tighten on the flashlight, my pulse quickening as I called out, my voice hoarse from the tension. But there was no answer, just the rain and the wind, and I kept walking, though every step felt heavier, more reluctant, like I was being pulled deeper into the woods by an unseen force. And then, suddenly, the forest went silent, not a single sound, not even the wind. And in that silence, I heard it, a low growl, deep and rumbling, vibrating the air around me, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I slowly turned. But there was nothing, just the darkness, stretching endlessly before me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my body trembling with a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. And that's when I saw it, just beyond the trees, a figure, tall and thin, cloaked in shadows, its eyes glowing a faint red. And it was standing perfectly still, watching me, and I took a step back, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to turn and run. But my legs wouldn't move, and the creature, whatever it was, stepped forward, its long, skeletal limbs creaking with every movement, its face a hollow, empty mask. And I finally found my voice, shouting for help, but it was swallowed by the storm, and the figure took another step, closer now, and I could see the jagged, gaping hole in its chest, like something had torn its insides out. And I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to think of what to do. But before I could react, it lunged at me, its cold, bony fingers wrapping around my arm, pulling me forward with a strength that was impossible for something so thin, and I screamed. But my voice was drowned out by the deafening growl that filled the air, and I struggled, tried to break free, but it was no use. The creature was too strong, and just as I thought I was done for, there was a flash of movement in the corner of my eye, and I turned, just in time to see another figure, this one much larger, its massive form emerging from the trees. And before I could make sense of it, the larger creature swiped at the first, sending it flying backward, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air, my mind still reeling from the terror of what I had just witnessed. And the two creatures faced off, circling each other, growling low and menacing, and I knew I had to get out of there, had to escape. But as I tried to push myself to my feet, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind, slow, deliberate, and I turned, and standing there, right behind me, was a third creature, taller than both of the others. eyes completely black, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. And I felt the cold rush of panic as it took a step closer, and then, in the blink of an eye, it reached out and grabbed me, lifting me off the ground with ease. And I could feel the coldness of its grip seep through my jacket, its fingers digging into my skin. And I fought, struggled to get free, but the creature was too strong, and with one final, crushing motion, it slammed me into the ground, and I gasped for air. My vision, spinning as the world around me seemed to tilt, and I felt the cold, wet earth against my cheek, the taste of blood in my mouth, and as I turned my head, I saw the other two creatures closing in, their eyes fixed on me, and I realized, with sickening clarity, that I wasn't just a park ranger anymore. I was prey, and there was no escape. And as the creatures closed in, I heard one final sound, a voice, soft and whispering in my ear. And it wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm, it was the voice of something much older, much darker, and it said, "You're ours now." And then the world went black. Story 20. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the sort of heavy, earthy smell that clung to the skin, sinking deep into your lungs like a secret you were never meant to know. And as I trudged through the wilderness, boots crunching against the dry, brittle leaves that littered the forest floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. And I wasn't sure whether it was the isolation of my position as a park ranger in this godforsaken stretch of land, or the growing sense of dread that had been haunting me for days. Something about the trees, they felt wrong, and the shadows between them seemed to linger too long, like something was hiding just beyond sight, waiting for me to look the other way before it moved, creeping with the subtlety of an animal stalking prey. And the further I ventured into the woods, the heavier the silence became, until even the birds had stopped their songs. The wind itself felt muted, as though the trees were holding their breath, and my radio crackled to life in an eerie burst, static at first, then a whisper, a barely audible murmur that sounded like it was coming from deep inside the earth. And though I couldn't make out the words, the tone was unmistakable. Something was wrong. My heart began to race as I fumbled with the receiver, but when I finally got through, the other end was empty, nothing but a thin line of static, and as I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, watching, waiting, and I knew, deep in my bones, that this was no ordinary wilderness. And as I continued my patrol, every step seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness, as though the ground beneath me was listening, as though it had been waiting for someone to walk across it for far too long. And I couldn't ignore the unease that was slowly overtaking me, the way the trees bent unnaturally, their trunks twisting like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky, their leaves dark and thick, the shadows beneath them stretching like a warning. And then I saw it, just a flash, a glimpse of movement between the trees, too quick to be anything natural, too deliberate to be anything harmless. An instinct kicked in, the same instinct that had kept me alive through countless years in the field. And I moved, silently at first, my heart pounding in my chest, every fiber of my being telling me to turn back, to leave, but I couldn't, not when something was watching, not when it had been waiting for me. And the deeper I went, the more the landscape seemed to shift, as though the forest itself was changing, warping around me, the trees now growing closer, the air colder, thicker, more oppressive. And I felt the temperature drop sharply, the sort of sudden chill that you feel in your bones, like winter had arrived without warning. And the first thing I thought was that the storm was coming, the one they'd warned me about on the weather reports. But then I remembered that the forecast had called for clear skies, and that gnawing sense of wrongness crept in again, stronger now. And as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. Something was lying in the underbrush, a twisted shape that didn't belong, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat, because it was too large to be an animal, too human to be anything else. And as I drew closer, my mind fought to make sense of the scene in front of me, the body half hidden in the dirt, covered in a thin layer of leaves and debris, the face twisted into an expression of terror, eyes wide open, unblinking. And though I had seen death before, had seen it in every form imaginable, it was the way this body looked that made my stomach churn. The unnatural rigidity of the limbs, the grotesque distortion of the torso, and I knew instantly that this wasn't some unfortunate hiker who had gotten lost. This was something else, something far worse, and as I knelt down to examine it more closely, my fingers brushing against the cold, stiff flesh, the sound of a twig snapping behind me sent my heart into overdrive, and I spun around. But there was nothing, just the trees, standing silent and unmoving, and I told myself it was the wind, that I was just on edge, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And as I stood up and backed away, my eyes scanning the darkness between the trunks, I felt the weight of the forest pressing in on me, every crackling branch, every whisper of wind carrying a sense of malevolence, and the unease turned to something darker, something primal, as if I wasn't alone in this place anymore. And I knew then that I should have never come out here alone, that there was something in these woods, something that had been here long before I had ever set foot on the trail, something that watched, something that hunted, and just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of it, a figure, standing in the distance, its outline obscured by the shadows, too still, too silent, and I felt a coldness settle over me, a bone-deep dread that clung to my skin. And for the first time in my career, I understood that some things were not meant to be understood, and I didn't want to know what this was. Didn't want to learn its name or its purpose, but I was already too deep into this nightmare to turn back, and as I backed away slowly, the figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, like it was waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then I heard it, a voice, soft, almost melodic, that there was something wrong about it, like it was a song sung backwards, and the words, when they came, chilled me to the bone. Stay, stay, stay with us. And though I should have run, should have sprinted back to my truck and gotten the hell out of there, I couldn't. Something about the voice, something about the way it echoed through the trees, like it was inside my head, made me pause, and for a split second, I felt the urge to obey, to let go of my training and my sense of survival, to just give in. But then the moment passed, and I took a step back, then another, and another, until I was running, my heart pounding in my chest as I pushed through the thick underbrush. The sound of my own breath ragged in my ears, but the feeling of being followed never left, the sense of eyes on me, always on me, as I ran faster and faster, branches snapping, the forest closing in around me, and when I finally broke through the tree lean, gasping for air and looking back over my shoulder, there was nothing but the forest, standing still and silent once again. But I knew better. I knew it was still out there, still waiting, and I knew I would never be able to forget the voice, the figure, or the hollow feeling that had settled deep inside me, because I had just learned that there are things in these woods, things older and darker than anything I had ever imagined, and they would never let me go.